Well, the number of people passing the Australian citizenship test has dropped significantly under the Albanese government. The pass rate has fallen to 65% compared to about 80% under the coalition. Now, new data shows more than 100,000 people failed the tests over a 14-month period between 2022 and 2023. Joining me live now for more on this is Professor Kim Rubenstein, Australia's leading citizenship law expert and member of the Independent Expert Committee set up to review the Australian citizenship test in 2008. Kim, thank you for your time today. We've seen a surge in post-pandemic migration and pressure on the Albanese government to get a hold on immigration levels. What is causing the downward trend of citizenship pass rates?
So I'm not the correct person to ask that question, Holly, because that would be a question in terms of the stats of numbers of people at different times. But the things that we can observe about the changes in the citizenship test might be helpful in indicating what is going on here. There are two things. One is constant and the other is a change in 2020 with an introduction of compulsory questions on Australian values. But the constant that I think has been a continuing issue, which is what constant is about the level of English that is required to undertake the test, because there's a difference between what's required by the Act in terms of a basic level of English to become a citizen and the level of English that's required to actually learn and undertake the test.
Yes, and when I ask you that question, I mean, there are obviously things that are going wrong with the actual test. I mean, the tests include tests on freedom of speech, the importance of democracy and the rules of law and Australian values. So obviously there's something going wrong here in regards to not only the test, but also how these people are being taught the values, the basic principles of being an Australian. They need 75% to pass. Where exactly is it going wrong? Who is responsible for teaching new citizens what it means to be Australian?
So I think there are two aspects to the answer. One is that there was a change in 2020. So that's under the Morrison government rather than under the current government. And the Morrison government introduced something that was not consistent with what the report of our independent committee suggested. They introduced a new section on Australian values. Now, there's nowhere in the Australian Citizenship Act, which is the underlying foundation for the test, that actually refers to Australian values. The Act itself refers to aspects to do with a loyalty to Australia, a sharing of democratic beliefs, and an understanding of the rights and liberties that go with citizenship. So that's actually not values. But if we get on to values, which I think is a really interesting question, I think these are things that are not just relevant in relation to new citizens, but all to those who were born in Australia. And there are sort of interesting questions, even for parliamentarians, about the extent to which they understand Australian values too. Parliamentary democracy, the rule of law. We've seen parliaments trying to diminish the rule of law. So I think there are some really interesting questions here about the appropriateness of that introduction of those questions. But from the perspective of the lowering of the pass rate, I think that's right in terms of the intimation of your question. If people are not passing that, does that mean that the test is not appropriate for citizenship or becoming a citizen?
So, Kim, are you saying that, do you believe it's appropriate to have that new introduction of Australian values? I mean, there are many people who live in this country who would argue that that is appropriate.
So I think that there are legal questions, and I don't think it fits with the legal framework. I think that there are broader social cohesion questions about Australian values, and I think that that's right, that's spot on. But I think that there are questions about those values that are not just for new citizens, so even though they're important, but also for all citizens, including, if you appreciate the rule of law concept, which is one of those topics that is referred to as an Australian value, perhaps also levels of understanding of how that operates, constitutional issues. I think last year's referendum is a reminder in terms of the levels of people's knowledge about Australian democracy, that there is a lot of work that needs to be done for all Australians, not just new Australians, in terms of knowledge of democracy, of our constitutional framework and structures. So perhaps this change in the pass rate is not only of relevance to new citizens, but to all citizens, including politicians, about improving the level of understanding of education for all Australians resident in Australia about some of these values.
Okay, Kim Rubenstein, thank you for your time today.
Pleasure.